The morning of the 14th of October 1943 began like any other in the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe. The chill of autumn hung low over the forests of Germany, a heavy mist curling through the valleys as dawn's first light began to scatter across the countryside. Inside the Luftwaffe's air bases, pilots rubbed sleep from their eyes, checking instruments, tightening straps, running last-minute inspections on their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. They knew the war was far from over, but there was a quiet confidence in the air. After all, for years, they had dominated the skies. The Allies had tried, time and again, to strike deep into the heart of Germany, but each raid had been met with ferocious resistance. The men in the cockpits believed themselves untouchable. Across the Channel in England, the story was very different. The United States Army Air Forces, still young but growing into a force that would change the course of the war, were preparing for something unprecedented. The B-17 flying fortresses, those huge silver birds of war, gleamed in the early light as crews climbed aboard. Each bomber carried not just bombs, but the hopes of a generation determined to bring the war to Germany's doorstep. But this day would be different. On this day, the Americans weren't sending a few dozen planes, or even a few hundred. They were sending over 1,000. The numbers alone were staggering, enough to strike fear into the bravest of pilots. The plan was audacious. A massive bombing raid targeting the industrial heart of Schweinfurt, a city responsible for producing ball bearings essential to Germany's war machine. Without these, tanks would grind to a halt, planes would stay grounded, and guns would fall silent. As the sun climbed higher, pilots in both armies could feel the tension crackling in the air. German radar operators were already scanning the skies, reporting the approach of unidentified aircraft. There had been warnings, briefings, whispers of something enormous on the horizon, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality. When the first American planes appeared, tiny silver specks against the vast sky, there was disbelief. And then, one by one, the clouds revealed their truth. The Germans were looking at the largest formation of bombers they had ever seen, stretching endlessly, each bomber casting a tiny shadow below. Eyes widened, hands trembled on the sticks, and a cold, sinking feeling began to spread through the Luftwaffe ranks. This was no ordinary mission. The Americans had learned from past raids. They knew that without fighter escort, their bombers could be easy prey, vulnerable to the rapid strikes of German fighters. But this time, the 8th Air Force had something different in mind. They would fly in tight formations, each bomber's guns covering its neighbor, creating a wall of steel and bullets no single fighter could penetrate easily. It was risky. The skies would be crowded, chaotic, dangerous. One mistake, one miscalculation, and a formation could fall apart, leaving dozens of aircraft exposed. But the Americans were ready. Every crew had trained for months, every man drilled in emergency maneuvers, every pilot and gunner prepared to face the worst the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Back on the German side, commanders were issuing frantic orders. Fighters scrambled from the airfields, climbing into the sky with their engines screaming, their minds racing to comprehend the scale of what they faced. Reports came in over the radio, fragments of panic and disbelief. Observers on the ground were pointing at the heavens, mouths open, eyes wide, as wave after wave of American bombers passed overhead. It was a sight unlike anything they had ever seen. For the first time, the invaders seemed endless, unrelenting, impossible to stop. The Schweinfurt Raid was not just a military operation, it was a psychological hammer blow. For years, the Luftwaffe had believed that German air superiority was absolute. The nation had built its confidence on it. But on this day, everything changed. As German pilots climbed higher to intercept the formation, they began to realize that sheer numbers alone were against them. The American bombers were methodical, disciplined, and relentless. Every move the Germans made was anticipated, every attack met with coordinated defensive fire. The skies became a terrifying chessboard, where each piece moved with deadly precision. Below the combat, on the ground in Schweinfurt and surrounding cities, alarms blared. Civilians ran for cover as anti-aircraft guns roared into life. Factories braced for impact, workers hunkered down under reinforced shelters, knowing that the city's heart, the industry that kept Germany's war engine alive, was in the crosshairs. For the Americans, Schweinfurt represented more than a target. It was a symbol. Destroy these factories, and the Allies could cripple Germany's ability to wage war, potentially turning the tide of the conflict in Europe. But the Germans were not going to give up without a fight. Every flak battery, every fighter plane, every radar operator was part of the desperate effort to stop them. And then, the first explosions began to ripple across Schweinfurt. Bombs hit their marks with terrifying precision, shaking the earth, tearing through factory walls, and sending plumes of smoke and fire into the sky. From above, the city looked like a hellish landscape, with smoke and flames twisting into the clouds. Pilots, gunners, and crew could see the devastation unfolding beneath them, a stark reminder that this war was no longer fought only in distant skies or foreign lands. Every decision mattered, every action had consequences. For the Luftwaffe, the sight of these massive formations and the destruction they wrought planted a seed of fear that would grow quickly into a chilling realization. The balance of air power had shifted. October 14 would become more than a date. It would become a turning point in the air war over Europe. The men flying the B-17 seconds knew the risks, but they also knew the stakes. For the Germans, it was a moment of reckoning, a day when their confidence was shattered, their skies no longer uncontested. For the first time, the true power of American air might have been laid bare, and it was overwhelming. And in that moment, above the forests and fields of Germany, as silver wings blotted out the sun and the sound of engines filled every corner of the sky, the course of history was quietly, irrevocably changing. As the morning wore on, the sky above Germany became a battlefield unlike any the Luftwaffe had ever faced. The 1,000-plus American bombers moved like a silver river across the heavens, their formation precise, almost mechanical in its discipline. To the German pilots, it was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs tore through the sky in desperate attempts to break the formations, their engines screaming, their guns spitting fire. But every attack seemed to be met with coordinated resistance. Each bomber's defensive guns swept the sky, bullets flashing in deadly arcs, forcing the Luftwaffe pilots into evasive maneuvers they had never had to execute against such overwhelming numbers. The battle over Schweinfurt wasn't just a test of skill. It was a test of endurance, strategy, and nerves. The Americans had spent months planning this raid, analyzing every detail of German air defenses. Intelligence officers had painstakingly mapped out flak positions, predicting the likely paths of interception. Bombers flew in tight combat boxes, a defensive formation that allowed gunners to cover one another. If a fighter got too close to one plane, multiple gunners could concentrate fire on it simultaneously. The Germans had never seen such coordination on this scale. For a Luftwaffe pilot used to attacking small formations, the experience was bewildering. Every decision had to be instantaneous. Hesitation meant death. On the ground, radar operators and commanders watched in stunned silence as the massive formations approached. Reports crackled over the radio. Hundreds of planes. No, 1,000. There was disbelief, and then panic. The very notion of controlling the skies against such overwhelming force seemed impossible. Orders were shouted, planes were scrambled. Yet no matter how many fighters took off, the American bombers continued on their path, seemingly impervious to attack. The Germans had trained for battles, for dogfights, for raids involving dozens, or perhaps a few hundred enemy planes, but this was something else entirely. This was a storm of metal, fire, and determination, moving with unstoppable momentum. The Schweinfurt factories, essential for producing ball bearings that kept tanks rolling and airplanes flying, were the heart of this raid. Each explosion mattered, each bomb dropped could cripple a critical component of the German war machine. From high above, the crews could see the impact zones light up in bursts of fire and smoke. They could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. This was not a simple bombing mission. It was a strike at the very backbone of Germany's military capability. And the Germans knew it. Every anti-aircraft battery, every fighter pilot, every alarm bell that rang in the cities below was evidence of the desperation to stop them. For the Americans, the raid was a test of resolve. Flying for hours under constant threat, knowing that a single burst of flak could tear a plane apart, that a single fighter could rip through the formation, every man clung to training, instinct, and sheer determination. Stories from the cockpit tell of gunners working in shifts, swapping targets, calling out positions, watching comrades fall and planes go down in flames, yet pressing on. Radio communications were filled with warnings, updates, and sometimes frantic cries for assistance. But the formation held. Even when dozens of planes were hit, the others moved forward, unbroken, their mission clear and unyielding. The Luftwaffe pilots tried every tactic they knew. They dove from above, attacked from the sides, coordinated strikes, tried to separate the bombers from their protective formation, but the results were devastatingly clear. For every fighter that managed to score a hit, multiple American bombers delivered return fire, sometimes shooting down their attackers. Within minutes, the scale of the engagement made one thing terrifyingly obvious. The old rules of air combat no longer applied. The Americans had turned sheer numbers into a defensive weapon, and the Germans were learning, too late, that courage alone could not win this battle. Interestingly, this was also a turning point in how air power was viewed strategically. Before Schweinfurt, there had been skepticism, even among military planners, about the ability of heavy bombers to reach deep into enemy territory without unacceptable losses. Many believed that without constant fighter escort, such raids would be suicidal. The October 14 mission proved both the potential and the limits of strategic bombing. Losses were heavy. Dozens of bombers were shot down, hundreds of men killed or captured, but the factories suffered crippling damage. The message was clear. The Americans could strike, and Germany was increasingly vulnerable from the air. For the German crews who survived the day, the memory was seared into their minds. Veteran pilots later recalled the feeling of being surrounded, outnumbered, and overpowered not just by skill, but by the relentless, unyielding tide of American aircraft. Some described the sky as being blotted out by wings. The sun dimmed as thousands of engines roared in unison. Others spoke of the terrifying precision of the bombing formations, moving like a living machine, seemingly aware of every attempt to disrupt it. The Luftwaffe had faced tough opponents before, but this scale was unlike anything imaginable. Even the simplest details had become deadly. Smoke from flak, debris from destroyed planes, and the chaotic maneuvers of hundreds of fighters all mingled to create a maelstrom in the sky. Pilots needed nerves of steel, hands steady on controls, eyes constantly scanning, minds calculating split-second decisions. One wrong move could send a plane spinning into the ground or into the fire of a defensive turret. And yet, despite the chaos, the Americans pressed on. Their discipline, their preparation, and their courage turned what might have been an impossible mission into a historic demonstration of industrial and military might. By late afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the Americans began to turn for home. Many bombers were damaged, crews exhausted, yet their objective had been achieved. Schweinfurt's factories lay in ruins, smoke rising into the evening sky, a testament to both the destructive power of modern warfare and the bravery of the men who had flown into the jaws of death. The Luftwaffe, for its part, had fought fiercely, but even their best efforts had failed to stop the Americans. The reality was unavoidable. The air war had changed forever. The Germans could no longer control the skies, and every pilot who looked up at a silver bomber formation from that day forward understood that they were facing an enemy capable of overwhelming numbers and precise execution. The Schweinfurt Raid also gave birth to stories that would echo through history. Tales of gunners who refused to abandon their posts, pilots who guided crippled planes home against impossible odds, crews who had formed bonds in the sky under fire. Each account painted a picture of courage, ingenuity, and determination that added to the legend of that day. The massive raid became a symbol not just of American air power, but of the human spirit under pressure, of ordinary men doing extraordinary things in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The 14th of October, 1943, was more than a date on a calendar. It was a revelation. For the Luftwaffe, it was a terrifying confirmation of what they already feared but had refused to believe, that the Allies were capable of achieving air dominance in Europe. For the Americans, it was proof that careful planning, disciplined execution, and sheer determination could strike at the heart of an enemy once thought invincible. And for history, it became a moment frozen in time, a day when the skies above Germany told the story of a turning tide in the greatest conflict the world had ever known. As the afternoon wore on, the intensity in the skies reached a fever pitch. Smoke and flame streaked across the horizon as flak exploded around the American formations, sending shards of metal whistling past planes and crews. The Luftwaffe was relentless, circling, diving, and striking wherever they could, but the Americans held their formation with unshakable discipline. Each B-17 became a fortress in the sky, its guns blazing in synchronized patterns that turned the attackers into victims. The scale of it was unimaginable, dozens of planes falling, others weaving through clouds of fire, every man clinging to his post, every heartbeat counting. The sky had become a theater of both destruction and heroism, a place where courage and terror collided in equal measure. For German pilots, the realization was inescapable. This was no ordinary raid. Every tactic they had honed over years, every lesson in aerial combat, seemed inadequate against the sheer scale and coordination of the Americans. Some described the feeling as staring into the abyss, knowing that no skill alone could reverse the tide. In those moments, the bravest among them admitted to a sinking understanding. The war in the air was changing, and they were beginning to lose it. Orders from command came faster, more desperate, but the effectiveness of fighter attacks dwindled. The Americans were not just surviving, they were advancing, pushing through flak and fire to accomplish a mission that would echo through history. Inside the bombers, the crews felt the weight of both danger and purpose. Every mile flown over enemy territory was a gamble with fate. Gunners trained their sights on enemy fighters, pilots maneuvered with precision under fire, and bombardiers waited for the perfect moment to release their deadly cargo. As Schweinfurt's industrial heart became visible, smoke curling from its factories, the tension reached a crescendo. One wrong move, one mechanical failure, and the mission could end in disaster. Yet, the men pressed on. They were not just soldiers, they were instruments of strategy, their planes delivering both destruction and hope in a single flight. The explosions on the ground echoed upward, and the impact of the bombs was immediate and devastating. Ball-bearing factories, so critical to the German war machine, were reduced to rubble. Conveyors, machines, and assembly lines were obliterated, sending sparks and fire into the autumn sky. The Americans had struck a blow that would ripple across every German factory and battlefield dependent on those parts. The Luftwaffe, despite every effort, could only watch as the enemy achieved their objective. The psychological effect was just as powerful as the physical destruction. The myth of unassailable German air dominance had been shattered, and with it, confidence across the ranks. On the way back to England, the return flight was a gauntlet of endurance. Many bombers were damaged, their wings scarred by flak, engines smoking, some barely holding together, yet the formations remained intact. Crews huddled in their stations, nursing wounded comrades, guiding planes through enemy territory with nerves stretched taut. The sky was littered with wreckage, a grim reminder of the cost, but also a testament to resilience. The men who survived that day would carry the memory forever. The deafening roar of engines, the flash of anti-aircraft fire, the courage of those around them, and the relentless determination to see the mission through to the end. The aftermath of the 14th of October, 1943, was monumental. The Germans had been struck at their core, their ability to supply tanks, aircraft, and weapons compromised. The psychological blow was perhaps even greater than the physical one. For the Luftwaffe, the sheer size and audacity of the raid revealed the growing strength of the American air forces. Pilots no longer felt invincible. Commanders no longer assumed control of the skies would be easily maintained. Confidence had been replaced with caution, and caution with fear. The scales had shifted, and the Allies were poised to take full advantage. Historians would later describe the Schweinfurt Raid as a turning point in the air war over Europe. It highlighted both the power and limitations of strategic bombing, demonstrating that, while losses could be high, the potential to cripple an enemy's war-making capability was immense. The bravery of the air crews, the precision of planning, and the overwhelming numbers combined to create a mission that became legendary. It was a day where ordinary men faced extraordinary odds and succeeded, leaving a mark on history that would never fade. Even within the Luftwaffe, there were grudging acknowledgements of what had occurred. Pilots who had flown that day spoke in hushed tones of the sight of endless formations of bombers, the fear and awe that gripped them as wave after wave of American planes passed overhead. Many realized, in the cold light of reflection, that their dominance in the sky was no longer assured. The Allies had shown, without question, that they could strike at the heart of Germany, and that the tide of the war was beginning to turn. The 14th of October 1943 was more than a battle. It was a statement. It was a day when courage, strategy, and sheer numbers collided in a sky full of fire and smoke. It was a day when the unthinkable became reality, when the myth of German air superiority was broken and the Allies demonstrated the might they would wield in the coming months. For those who lived through it, the memories would linger, a mixture of terror, awe, and triumph that defined the human experience in war. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the smoking ruins of Schweinfurt, the significance of the raid became clear. This was not just a tactical victory. It was a turning point, a moment when the balance of power began to shift irreversibly. The men who had flown, fought, and survived that day had changed history. And for the pilots who had faced them in the Luftwaffe, there was no denying it. The skies they once controlled with confidence were no longer theirs. October 14 would live on in memory, in books, and in the hearts of all who understood its impact. 1,000 bombers, countless lives, and a single mission that echoed across the war. It was a day when the impossible was achieved, when bravery met strategy in the air, and when history itself seemed to hold its breath as the world watched the course of war change forever. The Germans had faced it, the Americans had delivered it, and the skies of Europe would never be the same again.